Hi everyone, it's Ruth. Today we're going to talk about weaving, but not just any weaving. We're going to be focusing on foraged weaving. Now, you may remember me sharing a few weeks ago that weaving has a long history. It's one of the oldest surviving crafts in the world and dates all the way back to Neolithic times. So it has a long history. Even before people were weaving together textiles to make clothes and blankets, they were weaving together grasses and branches to make things like baskets and fences and even houses, right? It is an old tradition that's still practiced today. Now, the weaving process is exactly the same as it was a few weeks ago. We're going to use that same process. The only difference in today's weaving is that we're going to be using some unconventional supplies. Now, foraging very simply means using the supplies around us, using what we have. And so we're going to be talking about some odd things that we've collected, that we've foraged to use in our weaving. A couple weeks ago, we did a traditional weaving using things like fabric and yarn, but today we're going to be using some odd things. I have a couple examples of how your weaving might turn out today. It could be anything from something like this, where I'm using a plastic Target bag cut up and woven into my loom, or something like this, where I picked up some weeds and woven them together. We're going to be using some recycled supplies and some natural supplies too, nature materials. And so today we're really going to focus on preparing the supplies and troubleshooting how to weave them. But to do that weaving process, to warp the loom, to start the weaving, to end the weaving, and to cut off the weaving, you can definitely refer to our other weaving video that'll walk you through those steps bit by bit. Today, like I said, we're going to really focus on preparing the supplies and tips on how to use them. So let's start off by talking a little bit about those supplies. I'm going to move my weavings aside. The first one, as always, is going to be our illustrated instructions. At the top, just like all our other illustrated instructions, it has a list of the supplies that we need, and then it has step-by-step the process that we're going to be using. Now, I'll be guiding us through how to prepare the supplies today, like I said, and to do some troubleshooting and offer some tips on how to weave. But to do that weaving process, like I said, you can definitely refer to our affirmation weaving video. So we'll kind of follow along with that today when it comes to preparing our supplies. The next thing we need, of course, is going to be our loom. Now, when we do the warping, like I said, you can refer to our other videos. So you'll need your warped loom, right? You'll also need that cardboard strip. You may remember me talking about that cardboard strip helps to keep our weaving kind of straight on the bottom instead of kind of getting all wonky in the divots. Not everyone has a piece of cardboard lying around, and so what I use is a piece of paper that's kind of rolled up, and that acts as my cardboard strip. What I'm also going to need is my tapestry needle. There are a couple supplies, unconventional supplies, that actually can use a little help when it comes to the weaving process. And so that tapestry needle will help with some of that. We'll also need our actual supplies. So what I have to work with today is paper material, which is an envelope, junk mail, a plastic Target bag that I'm going to kind of show how to cut up and use. We're going to be using some inflexible supplies, like some sticks that I found, some really nice looking sticks. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to prepare some natural materials like flowers and weeds and grasses. Okay? So go ahead and pull out your supplies. We're going to walk through how to prep some of these. And we're going to start off by talking about how to prep some paper supplies. Now, when it comes to weaving, we're going to need a pair of scissors, whether we're using fabric and yarn, traditional textiles, or we're using unconventional supplies. We're going to need to prep them in the same way. So scissors always come in handy. So go ahead and pull out your scissors too. If you're using a paper supply, I'm going to be using this envelope, mostly because I like the inside pattern, that kind of cross black and white pattern. But let's talk a little bit about how to prepare paper supplies. So if you're using something like magazine pages, newspaper, maybe found photographs, copied images, junk mail, anything like that, any kind of paper supply, we're going to prepare it the same way. You may remember in our traditional weaving, we used strips of fabric and yarn, and we were able to weave rows back and forth. When it comes to these unconventional supplies, they're not as flexible or forgiving as the fabric strips or the yarn. And so instead of doing rows back and forth, we're going to be weaving strips in. And so we've got to prepare our paper in strips so we can weave that through our embroidery floss. And so what I'm going to do to prepare my paper is lay it up against my loom. Now you can see my paper is a little bigger than my loom. And because we're doing strips, we want to make it just slightly bigger than our loom. So what I'm going to do is kind of cut my paper so it is slightly bigger. I'm just going to cut one end off. And then cut the other one. So I can use this kind of black and white pattern from the inside of the envelope. And then what I'm going to do is just cut some strips. Now for paper strips, you generally want to do something that's maybe 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch, somewhere in there. You don't want it too thick. You want kind of thin strips. And so I'm just going to kind of cut little strips of this paper. It doesn't have to be even. It can be kind of curvy or wonky. That's okay. When it comes to foraged weavings, I think there's some real beauty in the imperfections and the flaws that we see in the weaving. So I've cut a few pieces off of my paper. Now, I was wanting to share a little bit about some different supplies, paper supplies that you can use. You know, I listed off a variety of papers like magazine pages, newspapers, junk mail, things like that. I've also seen weavings where people have cut up pages of a book and kind of used each sentence as its own line. I've also seen people cut up plain paper strips and write their own sentences or their own poem and kind of weave it in the weaving, weave it through the weaving. And so you can be really creative with the type of supplies that you use. I know normally when we think of weaving, we think about those traditional supplies, but sometimes the fun is thinking about how can we use these other supplies in such a creative way. And you can write stories, you can take a painting that you've done and slice it up and weave it through and have this like wonderful woven painting. The sky is the limit when it comes to unconventional supplies. Again, we got to prep them a certain way, but we can have some really fascinating, some really enjoyable and highly creative weavings. So cutting them in strips that are just slightly bigger than our loom is kind of a good starting place. Once we do our weaving, we can kind of trim it up to the size we want, but cutting them in strips that are just slightly bigger than our loom is a good starting place for us. So I'll set that one aside. The next supply I want to talk about is a plastic bag. So if you're doing something, I've got a Target shopping bag here that I'm going to use, but if you're doing something like bubble wrap, I've used bubble wrap before. I've used the cellophane that gets wrapped around paper towels when you buy it in the store, any kind of plastic material. This one is going to be the most flexible and the most forgiving supply that we use. We'll be able to use that kind of the same way that we use yarn or fabric strips. But I'm going to use my plastic bag today that I opened it up and you can see I've just kind of folded it flat on itself. What I'm going to do is just kind of fold it in half long ways and then fold it in half again and then fold it in half again. And so what I'm doing with this is I'm setting it up to have a long strip, right? So now that I've folded it flat, I'm going to cut some strips off. I'm just going to cut a few rows off like that and open it up. And once I open up that strip, you'll see I have that ring that's the inside of the bag. Once I cut that ring, I now have this piece of like plastic yarn that I can use. And like I said, this one is kind of the most forgiving, so we'll be able to use it the same way we did our fabric or our yarn. So that's an easy way to kind of set up our fabric strip. Like I said, you can do this with strips of bubble wrap. You can use with strips of like cellophane or packaging. One time I did it with like coffee bags. I had rinsed out coffee bags, cleaned out coffee bags, and was using them as a weaving supply. I will say one of my favorite unconventional supplies to use in weaving are plastic bags. There's something that's really nice about the way that weaving looks. It's a very interesting texture, and you can use do a lot with it. Like I said, this is probably the most forgiving supply that we can use in our weaving. So that's how to do something plastic. Let's talk a little bit about supplies that maybe aren't flexible at all. And an example of this would be a stick. I like using these wooden sticks. They definitely add a fun element to it. So maybe we have a whole bunch of sticks that we've gathered up, but some are a little longer and a little shorter. We're going to kind of prepare them the same way we did our paper supply. Sticks are not forgiving. They don't bend at all. And so we want to make sure that we kind of cut them or break them to the size of our loom. And so you can see mine are kind of sort of already there, but I'm going to trim up a few of my sticks just to make them fit a little better. Now, when it comes to sticks, I like the ones that have those little knots or the imperfections, those little flaws in there. They're a little harder to weave, but they look really good in the finished weaving. So this, preparing it in this way, cutting it, kind of helps us set that supply up for success, right? But there are other supplies that maybe aren't flexible. Maybe you're using something like a found feather, or something like this, something that can't bend, and something that can't be cut kind of easily. And you're just gonna, like I said, use it the same way you would do this, kind of cutting it, trimming it to make it this size, or making sure it's okay for it to stick out longer. Maybe you have a lovely feather that you found that's maybe twice the size of the loom. That's okay. I think that's the beauty in the foraging, is that you're bringing in all these wonderful supplies that maybe aren't like traditional, enjoyable. So that's how we do a supply that's not very flexible. Let's talk a little bit about natural materials. So I've got a few supplies here. I have this blade. I'm not sure what plant this is, but it was a really pretty color, this burgundy color. I have some dandelions that I'm using, and then some, I'm not sure what kind of weed this is, but these are all weeds that were behind my building. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to prepare our natural materials. So let's say you're bringing in some leaves, some flowers, some plant life, right? Some of the supplies that we use are going to be a little flexible, like this blade of grass. Like I'll be able to weave that back and forth if I want. Typically, when I'm doing weavings with natural materials, I don't like doing the back and forth. I like the ends that stick out. So for this one, you can leave it this way. We'll talk about weaving it back and forth, but you can also tear it. I'll use this one when we do our forage weaving, when I show tips on how to use it. With other supplies, let's say my dandelion here, I like when the little poof is on the end, but you can do a weaving where the leaves and stuff are always on the end of the weaving, or you can have them where they're weaving through the center. Either way looks good. Here's an example of weavings that I did a while ago, and you can see the leaves are all the way through. And then the weaving I shared just a moment ago, I have most of the leaves on the end. So on the inside, it looks like branches, kind of like mini bamboo or something like that. The truth is, there's really no wrong way to do a foraged weaving. It's really about taking what's around you and being creative with how you use it. So those are just a couple examples on how to do that. Again, most of the natural materials that we use, they can't bend. They can sort of bend, but it's better to have them in strips, in short strips. Now, when it comes to natural materials, the thing to remember is the fresher, the better. So if you pick your supplies early on, make sure you keep them in a cup of water so they stay fresh. The fresher they are, the more forgiving they'll be, even though they're going to be delicate. As they dry out, they'll start to get brittle and it'll be really difficult to use them in the weaving process. So just make sure that you get the fresher supplies. Now, let's start our weaving. We're going to be talking about how to use some recycled materials, but also how to use foraged materials, natural materials. Now, we're going to warp our loom the same way we did in our affirmation weaving. So you can definitely refer to that to figure out how to do the warping if you need it. But we're going to go ahead and start with the fabric, with the weaving itself. So I have my paper that I'm using as a cardboard strip. I've rolled it up on itself, and I'm going to start my weaving by weaving that through the bottom, right? And you may remember that weaving process is over, under, and it's always the opposite of what you did the row before. The big difference between our foraged weaving and the traditional weaving is our supply, right? We're not going in rows back and forth. We're weaving in strips. So let's start by putting our cardboard strip or paper in the weaving. I'm going to start by going over my first string and under the next one, and just kind of do it all the way across that way, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under. And again, the reason we do this is because it sets our weaving up for success, right? It's so we have that straight line at the bottom and not some wonky, curvy kind of thing. We're going to start off by talking about how to use our recycled materials. So I'm going to pull those out here. The first one I want to talk about is the paper. Now the paper we're pretty familiar with, right? Because we've already started our weaving with that, right? So with my paper strip, I started by going over that first string. So with my cut envelope, I'm going to start by going under, and then the opposite, under the first one, over the second one, under the third one, over the fourth one, and just do that all the way across. And like I said, this is what you can do for any kind of paper material, whether it is magazine pages, maybe it's a painting that you've done before, maybe it's a photograph you're like cutting in strips, or junk mail like I'm using today. Whatever paper supply you're using, you'll do it this way. We're weaving those strips in, we're not weaving it back and forth. And so for my first piece of envelope, I went under. For my second one, I'm going to go over. And again, it's just like that weaving process we did in the affirmation weaving. So again, if you need a little extra help, definitely refer back to that one. But the paper process, you'll see, is just kind of the same using that envelope. We're building that weaving up. You can see, let me bring it a little closer. You can see we're weaving it together. It looks a little different from our fabric, right? From our yarn strip, but that's okay. We're using untraditional, kind of unconventional pieces today. So my first paper strip, I went under. My second paper strip, I went over. My third paper strip, I'm going to go under. Again, it's the over, under, but it's the opposite of the row before. And that's how that weaving gets built. Our weaving shows up. Now, it may take a moment to get used to that over, under process. But the more we do it, the more confident our hand will be in that process, the more confident we will be, and the better our weaving looks. There is something that's still very meditative about this process that's very enjoyable, I think. So that's how to do paper. Let's say we want to use something that's not very forgiving at all, that's pretty solid, like a stick. I'm going to bring in one of my sticks today. This one doesn't bend at all. So it does make it a little hard when it comes to doing the weaving. It's harder to do that in, out, like over, under, especially when you have one that, excuse me, that has those knots in it. And so to do this strip, again, I'm going to do the over, under process, but I'm going to do the opposite of my envelope strip. My last envelope strip, I started by going under. And so with my stick, I'm going to start by going over and then under, over and then under. And I'm just going to do that all the way across. It's a little tricky, like I said, because this is solid and it doesn't bend at all. And it may take a minute to kind of get it all the way through, especially if you have some of those knots in it. As you're building your weaving up, we're going to do the same thing. Remember with the fabric strip and with the yarn, we used our hands to kind of push the weaving down, scrunch it together, and we'll do that with our unconventional items today, our foraged items. We're going to squish it down just so it's kind of solid and compressed, and that's going to help keep our weaving tight and together. So this is kind of how we do that solid item, right? I'm going to do another one so you can kind of see how it's weaving together. But I started with my first stick by going over. So my second stick, I'm going to go under. And so you'll be able to see, again, that over, under process, just kind of gently going back and forth. It may take a little time, like I said, to kind of get used to that, kind of get that unforgiving, inflexible item across. So if you're using like a feather or something like that, that's not very like flexible at all, bendy, then doing this kind of weaving with the stick is that way. So you can see how that weaving is kind of coming together. We're using the paper strips, we're using the sticks, these unforgiving pieces that don't kind of wrap back and forth. We're doing the strips across instead of the rows, right? So let's talk a minute about plastic. So I shared earlier that plastic is going to be the most forgiving that we work with, right? It's going to act the most like the traditional material of fabric and yarn. What you may notice is the strip that I cut in the plastic is about an inch. It can be a little bigger, it can be a little smaller, it's all up to preference. But what I have found when it comes to plastic is that it's really helpful to use the tapestry needle. And just like the fabric, it's a little wider than the eye of the needle. So what helps me is to take the end of that strip and kind of fold it on itself. It makes the end a little smaller, so I can thread it through that tapestry needle. And then I have this kind of string of plastic that I can use for my weaving. Now the plastic strip is a little different. The others we've been doing just strips, rows. This one we can actually weave back and forth. And so let's start by doing that together. You can see I've got my stick here that I started by going under. So I'm going to start with my plastic by going over, under, and just do that all the way across. I'm going to pull it through. And just like with my fabric and yarn, I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail, right? I'm not going to pull it super tight because that'll pull it all the way through. Now you can leave it open like this if you want, but one of my favorite ways to do it is to kind of twist it up so it turns into a cording. This is also what I do with fabric strips. I just like the way it looks, but feel free to do whichever you like for sure. Now I've made it go through one time already, so I'm going to go back through the other direction. Like I said, this one is a lot like using fabric or yarn strips. So my plastic ended by going over that last string. So I'm going to start by going under the next one, still doing that over, under process, and remembering to do the opposite of the row before. And that's how our weaving gets built. It's the exact same process that we did with the fabric strips, the exact same process we did with the yarn, the exact same process we did with our paper and with that unforgiving material, right? So I'm going to kind of pull that through and do the same trick that I did with the fabric and the yarn. I'm going to take my finger and hold it down on that row before. So when I pull that strip through, I can pull it tightly, but it's not going to give me that hourglass shape. For my weaving, it'll still be straight up and down. It's just a little trick that kind of helps me, so it may help you too. Now I'm going to go back again. My plastic ended by going under, so I'm going to go over, under the next one, the opposite of that row, and just do it all the way across and pull it through. Now you may notice as you're doing it that sometimes those strings get moved a little bit. Just really gently kind of bring them back to their position. It's kind of like that fabric. When we use that thicker material, it pulls those strings. And so it just takes a little patience to kind of move it back in place. And then of course, just taking our fingers and pushing that material down. Right? So that's how to use some recycled materials. I'm going to cut this off. And let's spend a little time talking about natural materials. So I've got my loom. I want to suggest that if you are doing natural materials, to stick with just natural materials in your weaving. If you're doing recycled items, just stick with recycled items, keep those kind of separate. And the reason for that is because the natural materials need to dry, and so we treat them a little differently than we would our recycled materials. So let's start off. I'm going to use this strip. Using natural materials, I think, is really nice. One of the things that I really enjoy about natural materials is that it's very temporary. And there's something that's really nice about working on a piece of art that's temporary, right? It doesn't last for a long time. There are things that we can do to help preserve the weaving, those natural materials, as long as we can, but they don't last forever. And I think the nice thing about using those natural materials, those temporary materials, is that it makes that process more special, right? More precious, because the weaving becomes all about that process of making instead of the end result, right? And I think there's something that's really beautiful about that. We've talked before about how weavings can be this very therapeutic and meditative process, because it's that same thing back and forth, over, under, and that repetitive process is really soothing for us and can help relax our body, right? And so doing that kind of over, under process with these natural materials can be enjoyable on a whole nother level besides just that repetitive process. By making it temporary, by making it last for only a short while, it makes that making time more precious to us. So I'm going to talk about using this kind of blade of grass first. Doing that weaving, I think sometimes for natural materials, it's easier to use the part that was the closest to the ground instead of the tip. So instead of the area that has the flowers at the top of the leaves, using the stem part that's closest to the ground is a little easier, because generally that's the more firm part, the tougher part, and makes it easier to do the weaving process. So I'm going to start by taking my blade of grass, and I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to do the opposite of what I did for my cardboard strip that I put through. Remember, we do the opposite, and it helps build that weaving. So with my cardboard strip, I started by going over. So with my blade of grass, I'm going to go under, then over, and then under. Do the opposite of that row before, but still do that over, under weaving process, right? That same process is what we use for all sorts of weavings. That process hasn't changed. The looms may have changed, our supplies may have changed, but the truth is that process of weaving, that over, under, the opposite of what we did before, that has been consistent since the beginning of time, the beginning of weaving time. So I have my blade of grass that I'm sending through, right? I have my one row. It looks good, right? So there are two things that we could do. We can either leave it like this, right? And then take the other end and weave it through, so it has kind of that fold in there. That's possible. Or you can just kind of tear it and weave another strip through. I'm more inclined to do it this way because that bending sometimes breaks the plant material, and that's like not always the best for me. But if that's what you like, then that's perfectly okay for you. That's one of the great things about doing art, is that you can do whatever you feel right doing. It doesn't have to be a certain way. As long as we're doing that weaving process of over, under, and the opposite of the row before, it doesn't matter what supplies you use, really, or how you treat the supplies. It's all, it can all be very preference related. So see, I've got my two blades of grass that are starting to be woven together. This color, this kind of purple burgundy eggplant color, is really nice. So I have it, I've started my weaving. You can see each row is the opposite of the row before. And so we're just going to kind of weave that through. A blade of grass is a little easier. Those long blades are a little easier because they have those no leaves or spikes or anything sticking out, branches are sticking out. So they're pretty easy to weave through. But what happens if you have something that has a lot of leaves in it? How do you do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. So I'm going to do this dandelion thing here, and you can see that I've got the leaves that are kind of built up, sticking out throughout it. So what I'm going to do is kind of keep them together, and I'm not going to use the end where the flower is. I'm going to use the stem that was the closest to the ground, and I'm going to start weaving that way. Now for my blade of grass, I started by going over. So with my dandelion, I'm going to go under, over, the opposite. Again, opposite of what we did the row before, that same over, under process. And you can see I'm just kind of feeding it through. We want to be a little careful with our plant material because it is a little delicate. It's not going to last. And so it needs to be done like with care, with gentleness in our touch. So I'm going to weave it through, and you can see as I'm weaving it through that it's pulling those strings. So we'll just be a little gentle with it, kind of straighten those strings out once we get them through. Like I said, I like having the little bit of flower on the end. I think there's something special about how that looks, something nice about how that looks. So I'm going to leave that through. And then I'm just going to take my hand, just like I did with my fabric strips, with my yarn, with my paper, with all my supplies, just kind of push it down so it gets close to the row. And you can see my end is a little large, sticking out. So I'm just going to kind of break that up a little bit. And that's how we do that kind of supply. I'm going to bring in something that has a little more leaf to it. And we'll just kind of do that the same way. These leaves, when we're done, they'll kind of stick out on the end. So it'll be just kind of that plain stem on the center. And that's just kind of a nice different look as well. So I'm just going to start it by doing that same process. I'm starting with the stem that's closest to the ground and leaving the top end, the most fragile part, as the last piece that gets woven through. And so my dandelion ended by going under. So I'm going to start with this weave by going over, and then just kind of go that same process, over, under, the opposite of that dandelion, the opposite of the row before. Sometimes having nails really helps with weaving. I don't usually have nails because I do a lot of painting and printing, and so it always gets in the way. But having nails sometimes is really helpful because you can pick up those strings. So you can see I've got my greenery woven through, just kind of straightening out some of those strings, and then just kind of pushing down. Now, one of the things to think about is that as our natural material dries, it shrinks, right? When that moisture leaves the plant material, it gets smaller. And so just paying attention to that as it dries, as it gets smaller, and just kind of push it down gradually, make it closer and closer so it has a tighter weave, is going to be better in the long run. One of the things that I like doing after I've made my plant weaving, my natural material weaving, is I'll put a piece of wax paper on top and then press it with some heavy books. And so what that does is kind of hold it in place so it dries flat, and it makes it easier to cut off and hang. It lasts a little longer that way too. Now, when it comes to weaving recycled materials, of course, you can cut that off and tie it off as soon as you're done. With plant materials, I want to recommend kind of leaving it on the loom while it dries and then cutting it off and tying it. And that way you can make sure that all those pieces get kind of scrunched down to the bottom. And again, when it comes to warping our loom, starting the weaving, ending the weaving, and tying it off, you can definitely refer to our affirmation weaving where it walks through that process step by step. Today, like I said, we're just talking about the different foraged materials, how to prep them, and troubleshooting ways on how to weave them through. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to natural materials is what if you have like a flower, something that's not stem stalky that you can weave through. Maybe you're using something like, maybe I want to use these dandelions here. What I can do with this, instead of weaving it through, if I have a bloom, maybe I have a rose or a peony, something that's even bigger. One of the things that I can do with that is weave it through at the end. So I'll take my finished weaving, my plant weaving here, And if I want to add that kind of flower, that last bit in, instead of weaving it through the loom, what I can do is weave it through, stick it through my weaving here. So I'll show you up close. I'll stick it through like that. And so as it hangs, I have this really pretty flower that kind of sticks out. I hope this process has been enjoyable for you. It always is for me. Doing this weaving process, like I said, is something that's fun and can be very meditative and relaxing. And hopefully you're experiencing that too. I think there's something that's really nice about foraging for supplies. I know I've shared before that one of my favorite things to do is forage for supplies for pigments to use in painting or dyeing fibers. It's a really enjoyable process to use the things around me. I love the idea of repurposing and taking things that don't normally go together and making them work in a really beautiful and unique way. And so doing these kind of forage weavings can be really fun and enjoyable. I want to challenge you to think outside the box. Think about what other supplies that you can bring in that would make an interesting weaving. This kind of creativity is really good for our brains. Thinking outside the box, problem solving skills, those are really good things to do. Thanks so much for joining me today and following along with me on how to prep some of our foraged materials for our weaving process. Happy weaving, everyone, and we'll see you soon.